Dear Lord, as we proceed in our deliberations, we ask that you guard and guide our footsteps, our thoughts, and our actions, so that we may consider all in front of us, and that all that we do may be to the glorification of your word and your Son. In Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.
Thank you very much. Apologies for absence. We have apologies from the following members: Witter, Campbell, Holness, Dunn, Clark, Cuthbert, Flynn. I would add Daly and Jackson. And he's on his way? All right. I wasn't sure. And Phillips. We also have an apology from the Auditor General, Mrs. Monroe Ellis, who is, I believe, on leave? Yeah, on leave. It falls to me to welcome everyone here. And in particular, I wish to welcome the new Permanent Secretary in the Ministry with responsibility for energy and other matters, Mrs. Carol Palmer, formerly of the Ministry of Justice. Welcome, Mrs. Palmer.
Thank you, sir.
Very pleased to have you here. And I want to also mention that we have in the gallery some students from two primary schools, Cedar Valley and Trinityville. Welcome. It's lovely to have you here in our Parliament. I hope you find it interesting. And of course, the rules of engagement allow you to listen and so on, but not to make any audible sound. But welcome, and it's lovely to have you here. This is the first meeting of the PAC since the budget process. We had taken a break during the annual budget process, and that is now complete, and we are resuming. We have before us two sets of minutes, which I propose to take for approval. Those are minutes of the meetings of February the 5th and February the 13th, respectively. I will go through them page by page so that if there are any amendments that anyone wishes to make, they can bring them to our attention. So beginning with the minutes of Tuesday, February the 5th, 2019, page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6. There's one amendment I want to propose on page 6. It's in the fourth paragraph of the page, a sentence that just more than halfway through that paragraph, where he was therefore of the view that the Permanent Secretary could not. There seems to be some words missing. I think perhaps the words "give the impression" should be inserted there. Should not give the impression as if the government had something to hide, etc. Page 7.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
I missed that. Could you just...
On page 6, I'm not sure if is your legal size paper or letter size?
Legal size.
Good. In the fourth paragraph, the one that begins Member Warmington, about halfway, just up more than halfway down, the sentence begins, he was therefore of the view.
Yes.
He was therefore of the view that the Permanent Secretary could not, and there's some words missing.
Could not, and the word...
And I've added
act,
the words, give the impression.
Or could not give the impression
Yes.
that the government...
Yeah, or is it, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Welcome, Member Jackson. I have a note from the Marshal. The person who is driving the vehicle license plate number 4105HJ, please remove it as it is blocking someone who needs to leave. 4105HJ. I'm not sure I don't know what type of vehicle it is. Yeah, all right. Page 7. page 8, page 9, page 10, page 11, one point to note here, in the third paragraph, and this is not an amendment, but normally you put in bold where a request is made, and it says, Member Fist asked the Permanent Secretary to provide the committee with a copy of the strong letter that she intended to write to the General Manager after this was done. So we would like to see a copy of that letter.
Page 11 you're on?
Page 12.
Page 12?
Sorry, page 12.
But that would have been the former Permanent Secretary.
Yes, it would have been the former. Page 13, page 14, page 15, and page 16. There's one amendment on page 16. The final paragraph before any other business. It says gas exploration. I think that's probably supposed to be exploration. Yeah. I hope it doesn't expire before we find it. So those are the minutes of the 5th of February. Would anyone care to move for the adoption as amended? So moved by Member Bunting, seconded by Member Hannah. I will move to the minutes. I'll move to the minutes of the 13th of February. Again, going through by page. I have one query on this, Madam Clerk. There are several references in it to the previous day, and
It was the day before, which was the,
well, this was a Tuesday.
oh, it would have been the previous week.
I think it's the previous meeting of the House is what that's supposed to be referring to.
Right, because they kept saying the previous days.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
this meeting was on Wednesday, so maybe the amendment was here.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it's just
All right, thank you. So the correct actual amendment is to the date of the meeting, which is incorrectly stated as Tuesday, February the 13th, when in fact it was Wednesday.
right.
Yes, so the reference to the previous day is correct. Thank you. So if we could just amend that on the page 1.
So what was it? According to clarification.
Was it the 14th? Or
No, the 14th was the Thursday.
no, it's the 13th. Yeah, same day. Yes. Page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, page 7, page 8, page 9, page 10. On page 10 in the second paragraph from the top, second line from the end, the word secretary is missing after permanent. Right where your finger is. Permanent,
Provided by the
permanent secretary.
were incorrect.
What? Page 10. Remember who this?
Oh,
Yeah.
I know. Remember, it's not my first time.
Page 11.
Yeah, but then
Page
we
12.
stop it and do it first and then
Page 13.
invite us in because we're not a part
Page
of that.
14. Page 15. Page 16. I have one point I wish to make. There are several references in the minutes to the word precedence, which is, it's precedent. I think that the word precedence is used correctly only once, which is in relation to something that Dr. Guy said, meaning priority, something having precedence, meaning having priority over something else. Precedent meaning something which serves as an example or as a guiding rule for something that follows is precedent. and it's all over the minutes. I didn't bother to try and correct it individually. All right, so with those corrections, could I have someone move for the adoption of the minutes as amended? Moved by Member Hannah, seconded by Member Bunting. Thank you very much. Okay, I would at this point just want to formally welcome back Madam Clark, who had a last time was not very well the last time we saw her, and happily she seems much better now. And we hope that the looks are not deceiving, that you are indeed feeling a lot better. So welcome. We also should mention that we have been provided by the new permanent secretary in the ministry this wonderful bundle with a covering letter and 15, I think, exhibits, which we're very grateful for and is very helpful. And at this point, we move on to item 6 of the agenda, the continuation of the discussion on the Audit General's review of aspects of the Petroleum Corporation of Jamaica and PCJ and Petrojam rather. Now, this information having been provided for us, arising out of the requests that were made, is there anything that anyone wants to raise in relation to this information at this point?
Some of them are, or many of them are matters arising from one of the sets of minutes that we just completed. So I don't know if those, some will require time for their own review. A number of the audited statements, for example, will require a little more time, and it may not make sense to try and address them at this meeting. So it might be better, Chairman, to if we're going to deal, it's quite a substantive, a lot of information in here, and if we're going to treat with that, it might be better to set it for maybe the next meeting, so that all would have had time to properly go through it.
I mean, it covers a diverse set of issues. So, for example, the audited financial statements, I think, are particularly relevant to the issue of the viability of Petrojam and where it's heading and so on. There are some specific issues which have been raised in it. For example, in relation to the former HR manager's settlement.
Correct.
And how that was...
well, even the former HR manager's salary.
Yes,
because,
which derived from
the questions. Well, it came up in dealing with the settlement, but in fact, this is one of those things that, just keeps increasing.
Yes.
Because it was 10, then it was 13. Now, in fact, we see it was 15.1 million, the annual, the final salary, as it's referred to.
Yes. What this is saying is that the incumbent salary, the former HR manager's salary, as at the time that when her employment came to an end last year, was in fact $15,119,400. And that is a new number that we had not been given before, and was the number that was used for the purposes of the settlement that she was ultimately paid. So this differs somewhat from the information that we had been given previously. We had been given, actually, it was a moving target. We had been told 9.2 million was the gross settlement number based on us, and then we were told subsequently a figure, I think 12 million or something. But anyway, we have this now before us. And
well, Mr. Chairman, all I can say is my expectation is that with Ms. Carol Palmer at the helm of the ministry, we will get numbers that we can rely on the first time.
Yes.
That is my expectation. So I would say, since there's so much information, if we try and start on this book now, we probably the whole meeting will be taken up with this. So I think my suggestion, Mr. Chairman, is that we come back to dealing with it unless there's something that was, easily disposed of or clarified, and then we move back to the prompt from the AG.
Yeah. Yes. Yes,
I think Member Bunting actually alluded to the the point I wanted to ask, which is the prompt that is provided, the new prompt, and I should ask the clerk, which is dated the 1st of April, the one that is here. This is the one that we are, this is one that was circulated, okay.
Yeah, I wasn't proposing to attempt to go through all of these disparate items. I just wanted to know if there was anything that anyone wanted to raise at this meeting from that. And apart from the new restatement of the HR manager's final salary as over $15 million, I don't think at this point there's anything else that I would want to get into. It has things like the notes of the hearings, the disciplinary hearings. It has, I think, 4 years or 5 years of financial statements for Petrojam, and it has numerous other things. It has legal opinions in it relating to the determination of the HR manager and so on and so forth. So I think we can go back to the prompt that had been prepared by the Auditor General's Department. Yes, Member.
Thanks. Petrojam, as I understand it, also provide HR and administrative support services to some of its subsidiary. For example, Petrojam Ethanol. So in the case of personnel matters and procurement matters in Petrojam Ethanol, I just want to clarify if those decisions, like HR decisions, were at the instruction of the Petrojam HR manager. That's one. Well, one, and my particular reason of asking is regarding certain transactions there that would have been authorized by the HR manager. So I don't know at what point we can able to just clarify that. So
Let's do it now. Could you just restate the question?
Yeah, one, whether or not the HR manager, HR and administration manager of Petrojam provided direct oversight and decision-making function for the subsidiary like Petrojam Ethanol. That's one specific question.
Could someone answer that?
Good morning, Chairman and members of the committee. Morning, AG and team. I will ask, with your leave, Mr. Chairman, that the Managing Director of the General Manager for Petrojam answers that question.
Yes, sure. Mr. Watson.
Sure. Morning again. So Petrojam Ethanol is a separate entity with its own board of directors, general manager, and staff. But to the extent that Petrojam provides support services such as in HR, what would happen in that instance would be decisions made either by the board or the general manager would then be facilitated by Petrojam. So if they want to hire somebody, that decision would be made by Petrojam Ethanol, and then they would ask Petrojam probably to place the ad and to assist with advertising for the position and to assist with interviews and all that. But it acts as a separate entity.
With that description you gave, does it work the other way around? That if Petrojam Ethanol needs to fill a vacancy in Ethanol, Petrojam main office does that procurement, so to speak, of those personnel?
Yeah, but the decision or the request would come from Petrojam Ethanol.
Okay.
And then they would ask Petrojam to assist
Okay.
in that regard.
A follow-up question to that, Chairman. In the deliberations in the PAAC, I recall a case being mentioned of a staff loan, or let me ask it this way, motor vehicle loans given to either Petrojam employees or Petrojam Ethanol. Are they given to full-time as well as contract workers?
Not usually for contract workers.
Not usually for contract workers. I would like, Chairman, if the General Manager could ascertain if in the case of Petrojam Ethanol, for any of its senior managers who are on contract, my information is that one such officer with a 2-year contract was given a 3-year motor vehicle loan. And that's why I asked a question earlier about the function. And it was approved by Petrojam, the HR manager at Petrojam. So I would like you to determine for me whether or not Petrojam Ethanol extended any automobile loans to contract officers. If so, how many such loans were extended to contract officers, and what are the terms of those loans that were extended? And also, whether or not the HR manager at Petrojam did sign off on those.
As I said, Petrojam has its own, Ethanol has its own general manager. So I can find out that information from the Petrojam Ethanol general manager and feedback to the committee.
Okay.
Ethanol has its own HR department?
No,
Ethanol?
the HR support is provided by Petrojam, but it's under the directive of Petrojam Ethanol. So they would make requests of Petrojam for HR support.
So things like staff loans and so on would be handled where?
Even if Petrojam would administer it, but it would have to be approved by Petrojam Ethanol.
Right. Okay. So we will move to the prompt. We have an updated prompt which was circulated recently. I think it's dated the 1st of April. Is that the one? Well, it's,
Yes.
yeah. Okay. Going through the prompt, it speaks to the audit that was undertaken in response to allegations of malpractices at Petrojam. It sought to assess whether the operational activities, governance and monitoring frameworks at both PCJ and Petrojam were consistent with the principles of good financial management. It also sought to determine whether the procurement and contract management processes and practices accorded with Government of Jamaica guidelines and good practices to obtain value for money. The background is that Petrojam is jointly owned by PDV Caribe, a subsidiary of Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA, on the one hand, and PCJ, the Petroleum Corporation of Jamaica, on the other hand, which is a statutory body, which is part of the Government of Jamaica. PDVSA owns 49%, Government of Jamaica owns 51%. 6-member board of directors, 3 appointed by the Government of Jamaica and 3 by PDVSA. And it speaks to some data around production. The refinery produces on average 7.4 million barrels each year, representing 56% of the total production capacity of the refinery, which is 13.1 million barrels. So it's operating at 56% capacity on average. It relies on imported finished products, averaging 7.8 million barrels per year to meet the demand of Jamaican consumers. And it says that $1 billion US would be required to implement the refinery upgrade project to increase daily capacity by a little bit over, well, from 50,000 barrels to 250 from 36. Yeah, so that is a bit more than a third, I think. Yes.
The page 5 of the prompt. Just to be clear. Yes. Good morning. I don't know if you have the prompt in front of you. You want to just explain to me if the AG's data is accurate, because if I look at it, it's about $6 billion worth of losses / exposure that Petrojam and PCJ have experienced over the period that we're discussing here. When I look at the figures and add them, it looks at about approximately 6 billion Jamaican.
How you get to that, Member Hannah?
I will need to defer to the general manager.
Can you repeat?
You're looking at page 5?
Page 5.
All right. Can you
Looking at the 682.7 in financial exposure on 4 contracts that the board looked at, and there was an overrun on some of those contracts. We've discussed some of these things before. That's why I want to know if these figures are indeed correct. You're looking at 17.5 in unsubstantiated projects. And the reason why I ask is that the key at the bottom from the AG says that essentially none have been resolved coming from your office, none have been keeping in view, and there's no X's in the boxes. So I'm not sure if what we're looking at with this particular table.
Well, as far as I know, member, the information here came from information the AG would have picked up during the audit. Now, in respect to the specific items, you would have to go through them one by one.
All right.
With explanation.
So,
as we
Chairman, with your permission.
Yeah. I was just going to just go through quickly page 4, which is a summary of what was found in the report by the Auditor General. So under the heading Weaknesses and Deficiencies, project cost overruns, consultancy arrangements which provided no value, procurement practices which undermine value for money as the objective, and questionable spending on donations and non-business events. Under the heading Weakening Financial Position, what was found was minimal and declining net profits, inadequate cash to meet obligations, and reduced efficiency in the utilization of assets to generate sales. And then under the heading Increased Reliance on Short and Long-Term Loan Financing was found that for working capital purposes and for capital expansion projects, the company was increasingly relying on loans, borrowings, both short and long term. Moving to page 5, page 5, key data in relation to Petrojam, which Ms. Hannah, Member Hannah has pointed out. These were the key findings in relation to Petrojam. They related to 682.7 million of exposure that the company had on 4 contracts, that there were unsubstantiated payments for consultancy services and non-business events totaling $17.5 million of unsubstantiated payments, that there were oil losses incurred by the company for which no account could be given of $5.2 billion, and that there was a meter and prover system which had been abandoned and which had cost the company just under $500,000 to purchase, more specifically $495,611 to buy this system which had been abandoned. In relation to PCJ, there was unapproved expenditure relating to human resources of $48.4 million. There was 11.6 in sponsorship awards without any board ratification, that there was 30.5 million sponsorship awards without any due diligence, and there was 2.26 million mobilization fee which had been incurred and was never recovered. And of course, in relation to PCJ, there has been no change to the board of PCJ arising from all of this. The first issue, is anything you wanted to say on yeah?
I'm asking the PS because what I see here from the prompt that was given from the AG is that they have no answers based on the key that was provided. So I don't see whether things have been resolved, whether it is kept in view, whether it is outstanding. The boxes are not checked. So I want to know if something has happened since that has updated this prompt, or are we all still at a position where nothing has been forthcoming to the AG?
I get the impression that the prompt, the keys applied to each issue individually on the later pages. So, for example, on the next page, page 6, issue 1, which is to do with the board and the ministry and the PCJ's deficient oversight and monitoring of Petrojam's operations, the key is applied there as keep in view, and we could perhaps start with that one. So issue 1 in the prompt makes reference to the fact that the inadequacy in the established oversight mechanism was demonstrated by the board of directors and its subcommittees' failure to convene regular meetings, which impaired their ability to undertake strategic management and oversight responsibilities. Petrojam's board did not faithfully comply with legally established reporting requirements to the Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology. In addition, whereas the PCJ's board consistently submitted board minutes to the ministry, we found no evidence that the ministry was active in monitoring and overseeing PCJ's operations. And there's a response from management on this. The board of Petrojam has recently appointed the PCJ's group internal auditor and group chief financial officer to Petrojam's audit committee and finance and technical committee respectively. This measure will ensure that the PCJ is apprised of critical information in a timely manner to facilitate more efficient business risk management. And it also says a directive was given by the permanent secretary that the minutes of board meetings, as well as the strategic and operational plans of both Petrojam and PCJ, must be submitted to the Office of the Prime Minister. Just on that note, going forward, will that be changed to the Ministry of Energy, Science and Technology, or will that remain the OPM to receive these minutes and of board meetings and these the strategic and operational plans of both entities? Am I correct to assume that those will actually go to the ministry rather than the OPM now that the ministry has kind of been reconstituted with its own minister?
You are correct, sir. And in fact, we are already receiving the documents in the weeks that we have been established, yes.
Yes, sir.
Perhaps I would just want to say in relation to the governance issues and the lack of evidence that the ministry has been given oversight. In the 7 weeks now since we've been established, the assessment and review that has been done demonstrates that the ministry does not have any representation on the board. It was a Venezuela PCJ board, and therefore there was no direct access to information out of Petrojam or indeed PCJ, and a full assessment of our 14 entities with boards show that the ministry only has representation on 8 of those boards, and Petrojam and PCJ are not included. efforts are now being made as we seek to establish new boards, that situation is regularized, because the ministry will have to have capacity to be at board meetings so that we can know what is happening at one level, and also to provide the required reporting to both the permanent secretary and onward to the minister to ensure that the requirements of the law and corporate governance are being adhered to. So that's one of the measures we are implementing in respect to governance, and this is across, as I said, 14 entities, because only 8 had representation.
So the idea then
up
is that
to now.
Eventually, the plan is that all 14 would have representation from the ministry on the board?
Absolutely.
That's where you're heading? Mm-hmm. Okay.
And also, I intend to make representation to the Ministry of Finance on the structure of the ministry, because it does not have an adequate capacity to do this oversight of the entities under its purview. And, you know, it's one thing to have a responsibility, it's another thing to be enabled to carry it out. And you know, we have been working assiduously these 7 weeks with Petrojam and PCJ to have been able to put this compendium together, for example, because we needed to provide the information that the Parliament requires and the Auditor General, and you know, it is my remit to make sure that we comply with what is required of us.
Mr. Chairman, as I said earlier, I welcome the new PS and the approach, and I appreciate the comprehensive package she has provided. But I just want to follow up on the statement she just made and the response in the management's response in a prompt. Whether or not the ministry has a member on the board of the statutory body, would it not be normal practice that the board would send its minutes and report to the permanent secretary in the relevant ministry? For example, I certainly recall when I was Minister of National Security, the FLA chairman every month sent the board minutes and any issues arising from that to the permanent secretary in my ministry. And if there was something that the permanent secretary felt it was important to draw to my attention, he would. So I am a bit puzzled as to why this would not have been taking place routinely within the Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology.
It's not unique to the Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology, sir, but I'm here to speak to that ministry. It is a fact that we have had to be asking for board minutes since I got there. And it is a fact that we haven't gotten the information. Where the ministry had representation, then the information comes in. And so what happens is that it's left to the disposition, if I dare say, of the board, whether it chooses to inform the permanent secretary or not. Because perhaps the other issue is there a role for the permanent secretary when you are body corporate operating on your own, or that you think? So, you know, things that you may expect, or things that you think ought to happen, or things that with normal governance arrangement managing public affairs you should do, it's not necessarily what occurs. And I'm just dealing with the facts as I have seen them in the 7 weeks that I'm there.
Is it your understanding, PS, that the proper practice, maybe a legal requirement, is that entities that have boards that fall under a particular ministry ought to be routinely submitting copies of their minutes of board meetings to the permanent secretary? Is that the sort of best standard or best practice that is expected, or is that a kind of ad hoc thing which is sometimes adhered to, sometimes not, and there's no policy on it within the public sector?
The Constitution of Jamaica gives the permanent secretary certain responsibilities for administrative arrangements for a portfolio to a minister. That's number one. Number two, the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act gives both boards and entities as well as the permanent secretary and the ministry responsibilities. The corporate governance arrangements, the FAA Act, and all of these things. So there are legal constructs that exist in Jamaica's public service for proper governance arrangement, effective and efficient government and governance operations. But what is missing, if I dare say, is where you ensure compliance and you deal with issues of sanctions for failure to comply.
Further to that question asked by Member Bunting, which struck me, in the AG's prompts management response, in the case of Petrojam, at least one of the board member of Petrojam was a member of PCJ board. Might be more than one, but I'm certain of at least one. Difficulty I'm having, Chairman. Petrojam being a subsidiary and a major subsidiary of PCJ, wouldn't it be normal or reasonable expectation that the board directors of Petrojam that are members of PCJ board would apprise its parent company, and then by extension the representatives from PCJ advise the ministry of the issues arising out of Petrojam?
Mr. Watson, you probably should take this.
The PCJ had 3 board members appointed by the minister, of course. One of them was on the PCJ board as well.
Sorry, Mr. Watson, you said the PCJ. I think you meant Petrojam.
Petrojam, right. So Petrojam had 3 board members appointed by the minister, and of those 3, in fact, no, 2 were on the PCJ board. So the chairman of Petrojam and one other director was also on the board of PCJ. Right.
As in question, those members remain on PCJ board?
I think one is
PCJ. Petrojam board has been changed, but the members who were on Petrojam board, are any of them remaining on PCJ board?
Only one.
Only one. And that's where my difficulty. In the AG's report, it points to a total dereliction of duty on the part of the board directors at Petrojam. How is it then that these same persons who have cost the company, person or persons, well in this case one of those directors who had responsibility for Petrojam and a member of the board remain on PCJ board with this clear demonstration of a dereliction of duty? And I would ask the AG, what would their comments be on this for our governance? From a governance perspective, what would be your comments or recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, there's a question of that one individual who was actually on Petrojam's board throughout these, or many of these events, but there's also the fact that the PCJ itself, as a parent body, was wholly lacking in its oversight of Petrojam as a subsidiary. Itself committed various breaches, and there has been no accountability at the level of PCJ whatsoever for what has happened.
Called impunity.
Yeah.
Impunity, Mr. Chairman. That's the word you're...
So I don't know if the Auditor General wishes to comment on this, but from my point of view, it is a glaring omission in the holding people to account for what has happened, that there has been absolutely nothing done at the level of PCJ in relation to that board that was clearly derelict in its obligations of oversight. Just want to make one thing. Is there something you wanted to say, ma'am?
No. Good morning, Chair.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I was just pointing to the recommendations that would have been made in the Auditor General's report. That would have been found on pages 16 to 18, and it would have spoken to the need for a framework document to be developed in keeping with corporate governance framework to strengthen the government management, governance arrangements at the entities. And I think with that, there would be some understanding of what the requirements would be for each board member, whether it's a board member from Petrojam or PCJ, who would have been also employed to the entity.
I have a question on that. You referred to pages 16 to 18. I want to go to page 17. There's a sentence there under the bullet 4, which the highlight says GOJ should commission an immediate review of key functional areas of PCJ and Petrojam. The sentence says the government must act intentionally to hold those responsible for failure in their fiduciary responsibility. Now, wouldn't acting intentionally to hold those responsible mean removing the board of PCJ?
I think in the Auditor General's statement, she would have assumed that having established that framework and having set the parameters for board members, then clearly, if members are not operating within the prescriptions of or the requirements of the board, then that should take place.
Thank you.
The follow-up.
I just wanted to bring one thing on the issue of the minutes, board minutes, just to point out that the Auditor General actually says on page 26 of her report, Cabinet Decision number 17, dated January 2010, approved the Government of Jamaica Accountability Framework for Senior Officers and requires that permanent secretaries as accounting officers must receive copies of board minutes and corporate plans for all public bodies under their portfolio. Yeah. So it is actually elevated to being within an approved framework, cabinet approved framework. And that was not being done. Yes.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, it does. And the reason why, my question to the AG, are you satisfied? It's a two-part question, because I've gone through the various prompts. There's only one matter that has been resolved that I have noticed under your deliberations, and even going through the appendices under Appendix 15 of the Permanent Secretary's bundle. Are you satisfied with how they are proceeding? That's the question for you in terms of keeping things in view. And the question I have for the Permanent Secretary is, the Prime Minister in his debate mentioned a number of new recommendations and items that were going to be put in place to deal with some of these issues. Have those been immediately implemented, PS? Because some of those would have justified some of the things the AG has also recommended, if I remember correctly.
The answer to that is yes. We are in the process of implementing all the cabinet decisions relating to improving the accountability framework. You would appreciate that the minister is now contemplating new boards for these entities. And so the boards are in a holding position while we do the due diligence and get information about different things and so on. And the minister is on record for saying that she wanted to have a more participatory approach to who sits on the board. In the comments that I had prepared for this morning, I was intending to indicate that these new boards will be subject to the relevant training to assume their roles as per the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, and to include the recommendations for boards outlined in the Auditor General's report, the various frameworks for the different things, the various upgrading of, in the case of Petrojam, the modernization and upgrading of their manuals and processes and procedures for their operations. And may I just go on to say then that we intend to be doing a review of the organization. We are a bit delayed because we are awaiting the enterprise team report, which will give, and whatever the government will determine is the way to go for Petrojam, because you don't want to do a review and then it becomes irrelevant in a few weeks. And so that is to be done, as well as a management audit. And I don't know, the committee may be aware also of investigations that are underway by both MOCA and the Integrity Commission. So we are taking a holistic approach. I may also tell this committee that I have written to the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service and received the approved establishment for all entities within the portfolio, because I will be looking at the entities as they exist vis-a-vis those approved structures that they should have, and with what's any difference that arises or that is being maintained, and therefore where is the authority for those. And systematically going through a process of examining the management, keeping the Auditor General's report in full view, so that nothing that has been recommended there is ignored. The compendium I've provided also has the terms of reference for the forensic audit, and we are awaiting the deadline to see what turns on that as to having a finalized document. And this committee should be made aware that the undertaking given by the Prime Minister for an assessment of any leaks, illegal leaks from the refinery was done, and the report was in that nothing was found. So we are going through, Mr. Chairman, all the recommendations of the Auditor General. The information here is as was provided to us by Petrojam up to the date of submission of this document, and we continue to work to get Petrojam on proper footing.
Madam PS, could you, the legislation that was passed recently for the acquisition of the shares held by the Venezuelan entity in Petrojam, could you say whether that legislation is now in effect?
It is.
It is in
February
effect?
22.
Okay.
February 22, and we are awaiting the expiration of a public notice of anyone who has interest that may wish to claim anything on it, so, to determine the final ownership. And also, we are any moment now to receive the recommendations from the Attorney General's Department for the composition of the new board under the new regime. So that is also part of why we have not yet appointed a new board for Petrojam.
Chairman.
So the notice was issued?
Yes, it was.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
I'm a bit curious. Notice for what? Yeah.
For anyone who wishes to make a claim, because the law now gives the government full 100% ownership of Petrojam. And so if there's anyone who has a claim to say they have a right to some ownership within the arrangement, remember it was a joint venture, then the government would have to give consideration to that.
I heard that the first time, Chairman, but I just want it to be clear, because my understanding when the Prime Minister spoke in the House, is that out of negotiation with the Venezuelan, there was some agreement, and I took it then, maybe I was wrong, that the proceeds for that 49% shares would be placed in some account, and I would believe it was an account for the party with who they were negotiating.
There's a process that is, the act that was passed has a process within it for the compulsory acquisition, expropriation, whatever you want to call it, of the 49%. And that process envisages a notice being issued, publicized in the Gazette, I think it said, where anybody claiming an interest in those shares can proffer their claim for it to be considered. So I think that is a notice that now there may be a separate process outside of the statutory process of negotiation, because we all know that those shares are owned by the Venezuelan government through the Venezuelan entities.
That's where my difficulty.
I don't know where that is at. Yes. We have heard nothing further.
Because by virtue of what I'm hearing here now, in the case of Venezuela, where you have two contending entities for state authority, the provisional president and the Maduro government. Is it the case that the what's his name, Juan Guaido, Guaido, whatever the proper pronunciation is, or anyone else can make claim to that 40 million or whatever the amount is? Any clarity can be provided?
The statute that was passed allows anyone to make a claim, and then the minister has to adjudicate that claim, and there's a process of going to the court if necessary to resolve that issue. So we shall see how it all plays out.
Because I would believe that
it was very peculiar to me, because the shares in Petrojam are registered on the share register in Jamaica, and annual returns would have been filed with the Companies Office, which is definitive of who owns those shares. So I didn't see why we had to go through this process but it's in the law and it's being followed.
Well, mysterious things do happen.
Perhaps we can move to issue 2 unless you want to.
Yeah, but the PS raised the issue of the terms of reference. Talking to the mic.
Before Member Bunting, I had originally asked the AG's office if you were now satisfied based on the keys that I had seen, because only one item was resolved from your report. If you are now satisfied with the way things are going in Petrojam, given the new dispensations that are there.
Not yet finished.
Thank you. At this point,
could you put the mic a little more directly to point? Yes, thank you.
At this point, we would recognize that a number of the findings and the recommendations will take some time to be resolved. So the ones that we would have indicated as resolved would have been those that related to the repayment of the guarantee. But in terms of the other aspects, in terms of oversight, in terms of monitoring of projects, we would have to continually review.
Yep. Should I go ahead, Mr. John?
Yes. And so we will, in the future, if required, do follow-up audits of any entity, as we would say for Petrojam, to ensure that the recommendations are followed through. So it's, as said, it's current and evolving, and so we will have to.
Mr. Chairman, the PS made reference to the terms of reference for the forensic audit of oil losses at Petrojam, and a draft PS was provided in the bundle.
Yes, because it's not finalized, we are inviting input. So
right, and I think the PSC
we've given up to April the 30th to provide comments on it.
Right, and the PSC had, but one of the concerns that had been raised at an earlier meeting of the PAC was that, well, two concerns. One is that why was the forensic audit limited to only oil losses when there were so many other issues identified, areas of weakness, areas of impropriety to do with the whole procurement? Why was the forensic audit limited to oil losses alone? That's one. And secondly, there was concern that since the ministry itself and the PCJ and Petrojam were the ones who, in a sense, were the subject of this forensic audit, that they should not be the ones supervising the audit. And I noticed under point 8 in your terms of reference, you leave that blank. It says this consultant will work under the supervision of the ... So, you know, if that was filled in, it would also make it easier for us to respond, because we may respond assuming that that supervision will be from the Auditor General. And after we make that false assumption, we later learn that it is the supervision of the General Manager of Petrojam. So, and not casting aspersions on Mr. Watson, but I don't think you can, you know, the person who is the subject, or the organization as the subject of the audit, should not be the one supervising the audit. So, could you speak specifically to this point 8, and who is intended to go in that blank area to supervise the consultant?
To the best of my knowledge, it is not intended that Petrojam will be doing this or supervising the forensic audit. We invite, and perhaps you could make your recommendations as to who should oversee the audit. We are making inquiries of persons, entities, to take on the exercise, yes, to do the supervision, because we are aware of the challenges as you are pointing out, member. Chairman, we are inviting comments on all aspects of the terms of reference, and we are serious about it, and we are awaiting that input so we can design how we go forward.
Yes, does that extend to the scope? Does that openness to considerations of what people may feel about the terms of reference extend to the question of the scope of the forensic audit? It is currently a forensic audit into oil losses.
Yeah, but Chairman, yes. I dare say, and I don't have license to say this, but I dare say if there is a significant response to say that the audit ought to go beyond an examination of oil losses, then I think the government would be hard-pressed not to take it on board.
Thank you. Could we move to issue 2? Issue 2. Issue 2 says that the PCJ failed to evaluate potential sponsorship awardees in breach of its sponsorship policy, which requires its Corporate Affairs and Communications Department to evaluate every sponsorship request against the PCJ's sponsorship objectives, criteria, and risk assessment. So there was a failure to evaluate potential sponsorship awardees against those criteria. Of 36 sponsorship awards totaling 39.7 million, 25 of the 36, totaling 30.5 million, were not evaluated in keeping with the policy. The chairman approved 12 sponsorships totaling 15.2 million. However, 10 of these, totaling 11.6 million, were not subject to ratification by the board. And this is all PCJ we're talking about now. Management's response. Processes have been streamlined to ensure that on a consistent basis, all sponsorship requests, regardless of the point of origination, are routed to the Corporate Affairs and Communications Department of PCJ for evaluation and recommendation for approval in accordance with the PCJ sponsorship policy. Secondly, all sponsorship requests will be duly evaluated by the said department against criteria stipulated by the policy. No sponsorships will be approved for payment without that evaluation. And thirdly, all policies, including sponsorship policy, are currently being reviewed by the PCJ. The intention is to have the sponsorship policy approved by the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service after that review. And there's an update as of February the 27th that the sponsorship policy has been reviewed and updated for subsequent approval. And there's a reference to Appendix 6, page 3 of the PCJ's specific responses on review of aspects of its operations. That, Appendix 15 is what here, page 3. Yeah. All right. And under the status and verification column, it makes reference to a memo of January 25th, 2019, which outlined requirements for approval and payment of donations and sponsorships. New sponsorship evaluation and approval forms were provided. But here again, what this is responding to is how things are going to be improved going forward. But the question is, what about the mess that happened, that already happened? That a chairman of PCJ approved 12 sponsorships totaling $15.2 million, and 10 totaling 11.6 were not even ratified by the board. Who is accountable for that? That is a clear governance violation.
Morning, Chairman. Let me just say first off that one of the things since I've taken on the post is not to be looking backwards, but to see how we can set the stage going forward, and that's why you've seen it outlined here. With regards to what occurred in the past, at that time, Mr. Watson was sitting in the chair I'm sitting in now, so we can certainly raise those questions with him, and he can certainly respond to those as to why he had to break down in the processes in that period.
Well, Mr. Richardson, the thing about not looking backwards and only looking forwards is that it assures that nobody's held accountable for what they've done. And that is not our job here. Our job here is to interrogate this report that the Auditor General has done and bring to light those things which have happened which ought to be subject to further action. And that is what I'm interested in today.
Chairman, still the chairman?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to be tempted to respond to this rubbish answer about not looking backward. The PAC, by definition, is examining things that have already happened that the Auditor General is reporting on. And it is from examining these things that we avoid this sort of improper behavior continuing. So please don't come to us with that kind of statement.
And member, I agree with you, and that's why we put in place...
Mr. Chairman, let me move on. The page 69 of the Auditor General's report, and this question is directed to the accountable officer of the ministry, the PS. It speaks to case study 4, page 69. I assume you've read the report thoroughly. It says, and I go to 413, and it speaks to, by way of letter dated April 24th, 2017, Citizens Association number 1 advised Petrojam that it had engaged a contractor to execute the construction works and requested Petrojam to make all payments to the contractor. On May 1st, 2017, Petrojam prepared a check for $9 million approximately payable to the contractor. However, Petrojam subsequently canceled the payment on May 10th, 2017. Petrojam presented for our review a letter dated July 5th, 2017, purportedly from the Citizens Association number 1, indicating that it was no longer interested in the sponsorship. which is by itself, Mr. Chairman, amazing. I've never heard of a citizen association not being interested in a sponsorship. 414, Petrojam provided correspondence dated June 24th, 2017 from another citizens association, Citizens Association number 2, requesting donation for the renovation of its community center. Of note, we observe that by way of email dated July 5th, 2017, a board member of PCJ submitted to Petrojam's general manager the letter from Citizens Association number 1 canceling its request and a new request from Citizens Association number 2. First question, who is that board member of PCJ? PS?
Chairman, members, I am still awaiting from Petrojam the information on the donations that they have made. I am yet to receive the documents. I am, however, in a position to let you know that this is part of the criminal investigation that is underway. I
don't believe that that would prevent you from answering the question. Who was the board member that submitted to Petrojam's general manager this letter purportedly from Citizens Association number 1?
But if I don't get the information, member, I can't answer you.
I'm sure somebody on the team would have the information.
So I will defer, but you say you are directing to me, so I am now going to pass it to Mr. Watson.
I'm not sure. Who would be the best person to respond? Latoya, are you aware of who that is?
Perhaps the AG could, the Auditor General's Department could refresh the memory of the PS.
Perhaps they have it.
You're protected here.
They don't know.
I wasn't involved. But she would know.
She knew.
Could you turn on the mic, please?
Yeah.
We're not hearing you.
Are you hearing? Yes. It's Myers. I'm not remembering the first name.
Sir, could you just state your name and
Latoya Pennant, Public Relations Officer, Petrojam.
Latoya
Pennant.
Pennant. Thank you.
Great. It's Myers. I'm not remembering the first name. I don't know if you remember.
A board member of PCJ whose surname is Myers?
Myers, right.
Do you have more than one Myers on the PCJ board? Or do you have any Myers on the PCJ board?
Myrie or Myrie? Myrie? Lionel Myrie. That's the name.
Sorry?
Lionel Myrie.
Lionel Myrie,
right.
Who is currently a member of the PCJ board.
Well, I don't know if the person was a board member. I just know that's where the email came from.
Could you identify who this person, Lionel Myrie, is?
He's a member of the PCJ board, sir.
Okay, so it is already in the public domain, Mr. Chairman, that Citizens Association number 1 said they wrote no such letter canceling the request. So I imagine this matter is the subject of a fraud investigation now. But PS, the Auditor General at an earlier meeting said notwithstanding the departure of board members or departure or not of board members, the organization and by extension the ministry still has a responsibility to ensure that these issues are prosecuted, whether criminally or departmentally or whatever disciplinary action. So I really would expect that for each of these instances, you would be able to advise us at what level it is being dealt with. So in this particular case, you are now telling us that this matter is the subject of a criminal investigation.
That's what I've been advised, and I am saying again, Chairman and members, Despite my requests for the information on donations, I am yet to be provided with it. And unless I don't have the ability, I had a meeting with the representatives from MOCA last week to apprise myself of what is happening there, because you have to figure out how you're going to get information if it's not being supplied to you. And I am to receive a letter from them because they are having their own challenges as well, and to see how I can assist the investigation.
Yes, all this information would be at Petrojam.
I would imagine so, sir.
So are you saying that as permanent secretary, you cannot get information out of Petrojam?
I am saying I have repeatedly requested information on donations, and I am yet to receive it. That's what I'm saying.
Mr. Chairman, this is astonishing. That after all we've been through in the last 9 months, that the new permanent secretary, who has clearly, set out to do a diligent, thorough investigation, is being stonewalled by the board and management of Petrojam at this stage 9 months later. This is absolutely unacceptable.
Mr. Watson, what say you to this? Why has the permanent secretary not received the information that she's requested?
As far as I know, Chairman, MOCA, every information MOCA has asked for, they have received. They have been at Petrojam several times. With regards to the donation, information, as far as I know, have been supplied to the ministry. So my staff who provides information, no, I don't know if there's an issue with the format, but as far as I know, the information has been submitted.
Who at the ministry has it been submitted to?
With,
who at the ministry has received it?
So let me ask, well, we had asked our CFO, Carlin, didn't we send information?
Up to last week when we met, I was not in receipt of the information. So if it came, it must be last night or this morning.
So Watson, who are you looking at within your shop to answer this question?
Sorry, I was looking at the CFO, Carlin Evans, because we had discussed it to provide all the information.
Okay.
She's right there.
A specific request came from the permanent secretary, and we did send a letter with the underlying documents that the PS had requested. It was delivered via email to the office of the PS. It came through the general manager's office, so I am too surprised that the information hasn't been deposited.
Could you just state your name for the record?
Oh, my name is Carlin Evans. I'm the acting CFO at Petrojam.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman.
Member Just.
Mr. Chairman, I've been at this place long enough.
It's a joke.
When matters arise, when matters are coming before the PAC,
She said it's email.
and you have a prompt before you, hold on now. The information that the PS asks for to come before the PAC, it's incumbent of the agency to ensure, not just to give, but to ensure that it is received. As I find it really astonishing that the PS, the chief executive officer, have asked for information. She appears before the PAC this morning, and no one can say definitively that the information was provided to her, so she can in turn advise the PAC and advise the public. It's not about us members. It's the public, the people of this country.
Well, PS,
Yes,
what
sir.
the acting financial controller, CFO, chief financial officer said is that this was provided by way of email to your office. So I would suggest that you check that out and see whether that is indeed the case, whether it is a case of it not reading those emails or what.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
mail for the PAC information that we request normally goes to my CTD for energy, and she diligently pulls the information together. Up to 11:15 this last night, I have received no such information. So, and I check my email before I go to my bed, right? And after I've had my devotion in the morning, I check my email. I have received no email, and I have been asking for this information repeatedly since I got to the ministry, when I indicated that I wanted all the information to put me in a position to inform the Public Accounts Committee. I prepare to come to the PAC on every occasion that I've had to appear. So I am very shocked that the information is in my office. Very shocked.
Chairman, may I ask a question?
Mr. Member,
when was that email sent?
Member, well, I'm looking at the copy of the letter here. It was dated on March 22nd. It was signed by the General Manager. So I'm not...
A letter?
Yes.
So was it scanned, or
With
how
the
did you submit it?
donations?
It was scanned and
We did
emailed?
a cover letter, and there were 2 schedules that actually outlined the donation that was made in financial year 2017-18 and those that were made in 2018-19.
Was it sent? Was that email sent?
Sorry, Chairman. To give a schedule doesn't give the details, because we would still not be able to answer the question that the member has asked. So I specifically asked for information on the sponsorships. Though I remember I said donations, and Mr. Watson said to me, sponsorships, I need to clarify what I'm talking about. So I said, whatever it is, I need the information for, as it relates to the Auditor General's report, so I can prepare myself to come here. I take my responsibilities very seriously, as I have been telling Petrojam from the 15th of February. I do not play around.
Yes, that is my experience with you, Madam PS, having worked with you for 4 years. Yes. Madam Acting CFO.
So we'll recheck our mailing system to see what occurred in relation to the transmission of that particular document to the office of the PS.
Chairman, may I, it's normal common practice when you send information like these to different agencies and departments, you have them signed for, delivered and signed for. We don't rely totally on email. So I find it a bit surprised that I'm now being told that they were sent by email without any hard copy that you can prove who signed for these documents.
Or even an email acknowledging receipt.
Acknowledging receipt.
Yeah.
And this is from March 22nd.
I'll look for my phone now.
Chairman, if I may, usually what we request, especially based on a discussion with the PS, is that we can send her by email, but a hard copy will follow. So I too am a little bit surprised that there was a mix-up there, but I know the information was prepared based on the request of the PS.
Mr. Chairman,
Member Hannah.
The concern I have, because it just seems that, Mr. Watson, there's a systemic problem with Petrojam, because even in all of the documentation that I have read coming forward, a lot of times that you have appeared before us, there is a conundrum why things are not followed all the way through. And so if an email or a letter to the PS doesn't even reach, I don't really have confidence that a lot of the other things that are being said to us are happening, because there seems to be a culture of incompetence at Petrojam.
I don't agree with that word at all.
Well, you can't sit here and tell me you don't agree, because if a simple letter doesn't get to the PS, tell me why it hasn't gotten there. If the acting CFO looks in her sent mail She could easily say if the thing was sent or not.
But she's
And
right
who
there.
deliberates or who checks with the PS's office? If the PS even says to you, Mr. Watson, this is not what I need, here is what I need. Both of you are sitting on either side of her.
Also, something like this, where you're fulfilling a request from your permanent secretary for a matter that is before the Public Accounts Committee of the House, and your methodology for fulfilling that request is to email it. Surely you'd want to ensure that that email was effectively transmitted, that if you'd follow up with a call, did you get it? If they didn't quickly respond and say, thank you, we've received it. Did you not do that, ma'am?
Well, the protocol, the transmission of documents to the PS office is sent through the general manager's office, so I wouldn't be able to answer that question as to the requisite follow-up.
You didn't send the email?
No, it was sent by the admin assistant in the general manager's office. That's a protocol.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Madam Pierce.
I will follow this again. Yes? Because we discussed this last week, Thursday, Mr. Watson, was it? Last week, Thursday. That was not before the 22nd of March. And in fact, last week, Thursday, was the 28th of March. And I raised this as a matter that I was concerned about, that I was not in possession of to come to the PAC. Right?
Mr. Chairman,
and we wrote after. I really did not want to come here to be in this position, but it is what it is. Yes? And we continue.
Mr. Chairman, could somebody, maybe perhaps from Petrojam, identify Citizens Association 1 and Citizens Association 2? Yeah, I'm not going there. A check for $9 million was made out to each of them. So I assume we would know what name the Citizens Associations are, or in whose. Well, let me back up. First, let me ask the names of the Citizen Associations.
Ms. Pennant.
So what's
Ms. Pennant is the one.
Ms. Pennant, that's all.
Ms. Pennant, Mr. Watson is deferring to you.
Okay, Citizens Association 1 would have been Macook's Pen.
Macook's Pen?
Right.
Do you know the chairman of that Citizens Association?
I don't have the name right, I don't remember. And Citizens Association 2.
No, and who was the contractor that the check was made payable to?
Brighton's.
Brighton's.
Right.
Was that the same one with the Bushing thing too?
Oh, I don't know.
Just Brighton's, that's the extent of the name?
What's the full name, please? As per the check of the contractor.
I'll have to get that. I think it's Brighton's Construction, but I will.
All right, Brighton's Construction, all right. And Citizens Association number 2?
Was Sydenham Citizens Association.
No. You want to give us a location of both?
Pardon?
Locations of both citizen associations.
Well, Macook's is. Well, I'm not sure about the constituency. It's Macook's Pen.
Both are from South Central.
Also,
the constituents of the minister.
Brighton's is Brighton's Engineers Limited. Brighton Engineers Limited.
And the second check, the one for Citizens Association number 2, was made payable directly to the Citizens Association. So this one was paid to Sydenham Citizens Association Limited?
Sydenham Citizens Association.
Sydenham Citizens Association.
Right.
All right. So the
But let me clarify, the check for MacBook spend, that was not sent to, even though there was the request from the GM for the check to be made payable to Brighton's, there was an email from the or financial controller, from a CFO, that he would not be making any checks payable to a third party and it would have to be paid based on the board resolution. So they had canceled that check. So it was not made payable to MacBook spend. That's why MacBook spend did not get the donations. Right.
You mean it wasn't paid to Brighton's? They would have been the third party.
Right.
Okay. So
So
they got the name.
You said McCook's
they did not get it. No.
The check was prepared, but it was cancelled.
Correct.
But not on that basis, because apparently,
Is that the financial controller who's on garden leave? Who made that intervention?
Yes.
I see.
That's why it was sent out.
you're connecting the dots, Mr. Chairman. So the Citizens Association number 2 got a check payable to, well, we now know it's Sydenham Citizens Association, and the check was negotiated by the Citizens Association. The financial, it's a $9 million check. I would assume somebody would know whether the check was negotiated or not, or if it's still outstanding. Certainly that would show up on the bank reconciliation.
Well, if I may assist, so I can confirm the check for Sydenham's, that check was actually negotiated. The one for $9 million?
Okay, so it was negotiated, and the Auditor General says that there is their review of the Department of Cooperatives and Friendly Societies records updated to October 2018 showed no evidence that both or either of citizens associations were registered. So in your investigation then, have the bank that negotiated this must have adequate due diligence on the account holder who negotiated a check for $9 million. Have you been able to get this information from the bank?
Well, we didn't.
Mocha doesn't absolve them of responsibility.
Okay, at the point when the check was negotiated, because it had gone through an approval process in terms of a board approval, it was approved by the general manager, there was no subsequent investigation about who negotiated
I guess, Mr.
the
Chairman, the question I'm asking, based on the Auditor General's report alone, it is evident that a fraud was perpetrated here. Is the company and the ministry taking the view that they need not have their internal audit, do any investigation of this? Because they're not looking behind, as we heard earlier from Mr. Richardson, and that if any investigation is to take place, they're leaving it to some external law enforcement agency. Is that what I am to conclude from this?
It's Petrojam's $9 million, isn't it? It was Petrojam's money.
Has Petrojam or the ministry made any attempt to recover this $9 million?
No.
On behalf of the ministry, as I said, I don't have any details. As soon as the details are provided to me, the ministry will be doing its due diligence and will be taking whatever actions are necessary to recover public funds if they are not properly expended. And so perhaps maybe that's why I'm not getting the information. I await the receipt of the information so I can do what I have to do, or I will seek advisement to send in the auditors there or the fraud squad.
Any other questions on this issue?
Just for clarity though, Pierre,
Yes, Mr. Watson.
members, this matter is one of the items, as far as I know, that MOCA is looking into as well. I understand.
Chairman,
It's not a dead matter.
I came in just when the issue of
Yes, Mr.
a contractor It has to do with Citizens Association number 2, I believe. But the ordinary report...
No, it was number 1. It was number 1. Yeah.
No, but it is saying that a check was made out directly to Citizens Association number 2.
Right, so it was not the contractor. The second time the check was made, it was payable directly to the Citizens Association.
Yes.
The first time, Citizens Association 1, they said make it out to Brighton's Engineering, who was who was to be the contractor.
Yes.
But based on an objection by the financial controller at the time, who was subsequently sent on garden leave, that was cancelled. And then a subsequent check was made payable to this new large, what appears to be a fictitious.
No, they made payable to Citizen Association number 2.
Yeah.
All right. I must say that the lack of concern about recovery from Petrojam's executives about this $9 million is surprising to me. I'm going to move to issue 3. Inadequate oversight. Yeah.
Like the case of the board member in Petrojam that we spoke of earlier, the chairman at PCJ who made all these payments authorized, is he still the chairman of PCJ?
As far as I'm aware, yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, when the Prime Minister spoke in the Parliament about a new direction and going forward on a new pace, I thought that part of the new dispensation would mean that no, this don't need any review. The Auditor General, the Auditor General has done a review, and it is contained in the report. That's the basis of action.
I have said repeatedly that the failure to hold PCJ accountable for what happened in Petrojam is a dereliction in terms of the response, in terms of the response to what has happened here. The Permanent Secretary has indicated that the new minister is looking at the composition of the boards. I would only ask that that be hastened, because the PCJ board needs to be changed. They cannot have done or allowed all of this to happen, and they remain in office. Indeed. Issue 3. Inadequate oversight and monitoring led to systemic breakdown in resource management practices at PCJ and Petrojam.
Before you leave that prompt, just on a broader policy matter, Mr. Chairman, and so this is directed to the PS. While I understand that if, a company operates in a community like Petrojam, in the immediate surrounding community, from a good corporate citizen point of view, they may want to support, a basic school or some other community initiative. But when it now starts to go far afield, way outside the geographic area of its operations, operating as a sort of mini social development commission, sponsoring, community, citizen associations, community activities all over the country. I mean, is this appropriate when we already have organizations like the SDC set up specifically to do that and who are cash strapped? Why are we siloing these, just because Petrojam has money, that it replicates the various state agencies? I mean, that doesn't seem to make any sense from a policy perspective, PS. There must have been some change to this by now.
Yes, Chairman and Member. The Cabinet took a decision, I think it was February, earlier to direct that donations not be given directly, but that they be channeled through, I think it's JSIF. I think that's the entity, if my recollection is correct. So there should be, going forward, no further, while we attempt to deal with these ones that demonstrate irregularity, there should be no further donations just being determined and given by the company.
Mr. Chairman, while my position deviates a little bit from Member Bunting, because I think it is important that particularly companies such as Petrojam educate, especially our young people, on climate change and the environment. And there are opportunities and spaces. The question I have for you is what percentage of your annual budget should have gone to public relations, corporate sponsorships, essentially? And in your deliberations, was this figure way out of field? Is it 2% of your budget? Is it 0.1%? What is it that is the policy directive, Mr. Watson, that would normally go to sponsorship of events?
I can't remember the exact percentage, but there was a budget for donation based on a policy that the company has, supporting things like education, sports, community development, what have you. I believe for last year we did exceed that budgeted amount. I can get the specific percentages for you.
Yeah, but if you look in the list of payments, which is in the Auditor General's report, some of them have a political flavor to them as well. I'm glad to hear that this change is being implemented, because it's, to me, quite wrong that the resources of a public body, which are public funds, should be at the whim of a politically appointed board to be expended on politically connected projects, whether it be sporting projects or any other projects. I'm glad that that is being addressed. Can we move to issue 3? Inadequate oversight and monitoring led to systemic breakdown of resource management practices at PCJ and Petrojam, resulting in material financial losses. In executing due diligence to inform its refinery upgrade project, the RUP, we found no evidence that Petrojam benefited from $17.4 million paid for consultancy services to conduct feasibility research and analysis, as the deliverables were not achieved. We examined 4 projects amounting to $1.5 billion, and for 3 of them, noted cost overruns totaling $615.7 million. For the other project, Petrojam made a bad business decision by awarding a contract which was $67 million more than the initial estimate, for which it could not determine that additional value was received. This brought total financial exposure on the 4 contracts to $682.7 million. Management's response. Petrojam accepts and recognizes the need for improved scoping of projects, improved scoping of contract requirements, and also improving its project risk management process. Petrojam has requested the procurement unit of the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service to provide procurement training to project managers and other staff members. The gate system is currently being reviewed, with expected improvements to be implemented in fiscal year 2019-20. And perhaps you can explain what the gate system is, Mr. Watson. Mandatory requirements for project management training and certification of all persons who are required to manage projects. And there's an update. As at March 1st, 2019, the Ministry of Finance Procurement Unit held training for members of staff directly involved in procurement activities on January 22nd, 2019. We are currently seeking to arrange another training session for the management team and staff members who are unable to attend the first training session. But you know, when you see projects of $1.5 billion with overruns totaling $682.7 million, I don't think that has anything to do with a lack of training. That is clearly something else. Mr. Watson, what is the gate system that is being reviewed?
We have a methodology called a gate process. So when you come up with a project, you have like a concept idea, and that would go through a gate one where you say, what is the project about? Who is the sponsor of the project? What it is going to achieve? And then it goes to another gate where you provide more details on the project, return on investment, all of these. Then it goes to a gate 3 until you end up at the last gate, which I think is gate 4 or 5, where you actually, having established that there is a project, it's viable, it's feasible, the return on investment makes sense, you have the sponsor identified, the project manager identified, then you move to implementation phase. So that's what the gate system looks at, to ensure that the project is properly thought out from the conceptual phase to the implementation phase.
Thank you. Mr. Monte.
Yeah, there's, in the Auditor General's report, I think starting at page 51, there are a number of case studies around this whole procurement issue. And this is, each of these case studies, I think, requires a little further examination. Let me start with page 61, Mr. Watson. It's talking about the main docking facility. You're at that page. Yes. Mr. Chairman, essentially, the Petrojam was faced with a decision to either rent 3 anchors for 9 months for $428,000 or to purchase, for 9 months, or let me start again. It would cost Petrojam $424,000 to rent 3 anchors for 9 months, or $428,000 to purchase the anchors. So there was only a $3,000 difference between buying and renting, less than 1%. In fact, Petrojam ended up paying $1.1 million in rental costs rather than the $424,000, which was initially anticipated due to the additional time that it took to execute the project. Now, I find this, given that there was just a $3,000 difference up front, and knowing that in almost every case we have looked at, Petrojam's projects overrun the time quite extensively. How could this have been a prudent decision, Mr. Watson, to rent versus purchase the anchors, even taking into account that they had no salvage value?
Before I respond to that, let me just put, Mr. Jarrett is here. He's in charge of the dock project, so I'll ask him to respond specifically to this. But we need to bear in mind that when we're doing the dock project itself, you had a choice, which is what caused some of the delays, between running the country out of fuel or delaying the works to allow fuel to be imported. So we had a situation where the dock was destroyed and you had limited access to bring products into Jamaica. When you're doing work on the dock, especially if it's hot work. So you have welding going on. So when a ship is coming in, all work must cease. And that created a situation where you were bringing in products, bringing in crude oil. You have to stop the works, supply the country, then you restart the work.
Yeah,
And
so
that
you are
created some
saying
delays.
why you're explaining
I'm
the
just
reasons for the
explaining some of the
delays and the
delays,
extensions
right,
of
that's
time.
what you're asking.
But I think that's something you could have anticipated before
No,
the
you
work
cannot.
started.
Shipping and even managing a dock in and of itself is not something you can predict. You have weather that will stop a ship from coming in. You cannot predict that.
But
One thing's for sure,
So
the
that-
longer it
that's
takes
what
is the more
caused-
rent you pay.
No. I'm just explaining that was a part of it. So I'll ask Mr. Jarrett to just some details on the anchor itself.
Mr. Jarrett, if you could just introduce yourself and your position at the company.
Leon Jarrett, Manager Safety Environment Quality, and for a significant duration of the dock project, I was a project manager. When the dock was knocked down, the analysis that is written by the Auditor General was done by us. And this was predicated on the fact that the recovery time for reconstruction of the dock was 10 months. We ran into some challenges with respect to executing the reconstruction. The main challenges were the fact that there was debris from the damaged dock blocking the pile driving, etc. The main physical challenge, the main logistic challenge, I think Mr. Watson explained that to us. Ships don't leave or arrive at precise time. If there's an exigency in the port, at time the ship will slip by a day or two. And if there's an issue on the high seas, the ship could come early or leave
But
late.
with respect, Mr. Chairman, that's exactly the reason why it would have made sense to have bought it, given the uncertainty, all the uncertainties that could cause delays. So you could have paid $3,000 US more to buy it. Instead, you've paid almost 700,000 US extra because of the extension of time. That doesn't seem like a prudent choice at all, up front.
With respect, Member of Parliament, we can say that in hindsight, but I didn't complete my dissertation. One, we predicated on 10 months completion time, and we would have had to pay to take up those anchors at the end. What happened to us is that we ran into debris and needed to remove the debris. The NCC instructed us to proceed to tender the debris removal. The instructions were submitted in one of the packages, and we had extended back and forth with the NCC and difficulties in engaging contractors who were not engaged locally. At one instance, even during the change from one government to the next, the chairman of Petrojam had to go to the NCC with us to convince them to allow special privilege, because these overseas contractors were not interested in coming to work here and remove the debris. During that time, we were held in abeyance. On one instance, we were held in abeyance for almost 2 years. And as I said before, we had the choice of one, not proceeding with the project and continuing our temporary course. I will close by saying, one, that we were assured by our insurer that this is a reimbursable expense, because the options were, if we interrupt the project, was to collect business interruption. And business interruption money could not run Jamaica. That was not our call to lock the refinery down and collect business interruption. That was a call of the owners, and that would never have been allowed.
Chairman, may I ask a question?
Wait, 1 second, Member Han had already asked me, then you, sir.
No, the question I have for you, sir, is in your hindsight, you couldn't have bought the anchors and Petrojam would not have been able to use them or rent them or have further use for the anchors?
It is unlikely we'll have any further use for the anchor, but in hindsight, you could say that. But at the time of the analysis that we did, it was prudent to have the anchors remain there.
Because you could, in fact, use them or rent them or have other ships utilize the service of it if you had created another business model for the use of the anchors to make money for Petrojam?
I was hazard to say, even with my limited marine experience, that we would not go into that kind of business. As a matter of fact, we got out of the marine business by selling the ships, and doing time charters on ships. So we don't want to keep that kind of marine asset in house because it is so inactive and would be so rarely used.
So, so you're saying here, let me see if I understand what the gentleman is saying, that the part of this overrun was due to you tendering the removal of debris from the area?
We had to do a special tender on the instruction.
No, I'm asking if the increase we have here, it also attribute to you having to tender removal of debris. So the cost of debris included in the increase we have here. Is that part of it?
Yes, sir.
All right. No. If I ask you, say yes or no.
Okay.
All right. The time when you expand and answer, you see, in this place, you get yourself in serious trouble. You go down slippery slopes. When you ask, just answer yes or no.
No.
What I'm saying here, let me continue. No, yes or no. Let me finish.
Fulsomely.
No.
Answer fulsomely, sir.
He has already answered. Well, I'm satisfied with the answer. I asked him if the overrun include the costs of tendering and removing debris. He said yes. But unfortunately, what we have here doesn't give that indication. It just shows the issue of overrun. It isn't explicit in saying that it's also due to this. I am speaking. I'm never interrupted.
No, but you're making an error, and I'm guiding you. I'm helping you. The Auditor General's report isn't talking about the overrun on the entire project. The 1.1 million is what they paid in total for rental costs for these anchors.
Include the debris removal. So that yes. Is not helping us.
So when was this? What period this was? In what period?
If you go to page 61, 3.129 of the Auditor General's report, it outlines it.
I'm watching it, I'm seeing it. So it is saying that this contract was between July 2012 to December 2012? What period this contract was? Am I correct? Can you assist me now? Can you help me now?
I'm helping you to say you're going down the wrong road.
And you gave me the help.
424,000.
Yes, you gave me that help.
You started off was the original estimate to rent.
Yes. You
and it ended up at 1.1 million.
Yes,
the difference between 424 and 1.1 is solely for rental costs. Has nothing to do with other overruns on the project.
Yes, but you already explained that.
You are obfuscating the point rather than bringing in clarity to it.
No, I've already accepted your explanation. I asked you to help me further as to what period this contract was. Can you help me? So why did not ask them that one? But why not help me with this? Sir, what period this contract was?
That contract ran from, I believe, I can't remember the date it ended, but it's probably 2012, but it started in August.
March 2011.
Right, March 2011. That's going backwards to about July 2009.
No, 2011 can go 2009.
2009 to 2011.
No, it can't be. If I'm seeing it, it says in March 2011, Petroleum breached the procurement guidelines. Work on the project was, that's 3.1.31 is the work on this project was scheduled for 5 months between July 2012 and December 2012. That's the period I'm asking about. So it couldn't be 2009.
Can you help me here?
I am asking a question and I asked the member to help me. It wasn't able to help me there, and I found it here for myself. He said the contract was between July 2012 and December 2012. Am I correct? Can someone help me?
The process apparently began in 2011.
No, I didn't ask about the process. I'm asking about the contract period. Remember, Mr. Chairman, what I'm asking about here is not the period of procurement. I'm asking the contract period.
You've already stated what it is. Yeah.
And there are various contract periods. The marine oil tanker collided with Petrojam's main docking facility on June 1st, 2009. And remedial work started from that month. But were not all the various works and the versions of it went straight into 2014, according to just what is documented, or 2015, according to what is documented here. So it was a very protracted remediation process. But, Mr. Chairman, I'm willing to go on to the furnace replacement project.
The issue was. I mean, you can try and make a big issue of dates and so on as to which administration was in office. The point was about why was a decision taken to rent assets when you could buy them for virtually the same price, and the effect of renting them was that there was a massive overrun, and we have heard an explanation from the relevant officer, and it was somewhat essentially saying that at the time he didn't foresee that these things would happen that would have caused this extensive delay.
May I just ask Mr. Jarrett, when you made the decision to spend $424,000 US, did this include the shipping and insurance from whichever port they were coming from, or this was just solely the purchase cost?
Rental.
It's a rental.
No, okay, rental. But you had to move it from one port to the port of Kingston.
Sir,
was there a charge attached to that?
Sir, I want to answer your question directly, but the question you asked doesn't have an exact answer, not a direct answer. One, when the ship hit the dock, we needed anchors. To buy anchors and bring them to Jamaica would take us 3 or 4 months to get anchors.
Okay.
So, sir, we had to grab what we have.
And those were available locally?
Locally.
Right.
One entity had the size anchor readily with the assistance of the Port Authority. So they were put in place. Once they're in place, the evaluation was done to see whether for 10 months we would need either to take up back the anchors after a couple of months and buy anchors and put there. To buy the anchors and bring them, as I told you before, would take 3-4 months.
Were you able to recover this $1.1 million part of the cost of rehabilitating the dock?
We recover the entire sum of money as part of our increased cost of working. Our reinsurers saw it as a mitigation against paying us $180,000 US per day for business interruption.
Thank you,
You've received that money? You've received that cash, or you're hoping to receive it?
We have received 17.1 million out of a projected amount of about $21.5 million.
What currency is that? What currency?
This US dollars.
US dollars.
Yeah, I'm saying, have you, as part of what you've received, you recovered the difference between the 424 and the 1.1 million? Is that part of what you have successfully claimed?
I will answer you more accurately by checking the numbers, because we have what is called an indemnity period, and we use them for some time outside the indemnity period. So if you so require, I will get the exact amount.
But just broadly speaking, you did not recover the entire amount?
Yes.
You would have recovered some, but not the entire amount?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So what Mr. Jai can do is give you the detail, because what we did, all the costs incurred to bring the dock back and keep the country supplied, we claim that against our insurance policy. And he pointed out we have recovered 17 million. We're still trying to recover the other 4 million.
Mr. Chairman, can I complete the answer, Mr. Watson? A piece of the recovery was from what you call insured losses. Now, the owners of the ship that hit the dock, If it went beyond our insurance policy, a portion of that 17.1 is from the owners of the ship, the marine vessel, the Great News that hit the dock.
So their insurers would have covered.
The
some
insurer
component of it.
covered the uninsured
All
losses.
right, I want to move now to the furnace replacement, which is what is it called? 3D in terms of case studies, page
65?
65.
Go ahead.
And perhaps, P.S., you don't mind, these are technical issues if I direct them straight to Mr. Watson. Mr. Watson, the 3137 says there was, Petrojam operates a power former F2 furnace at its refinery, which it uses to convert crude oil into finished products. An assessment was done. In fact, there was an issue with the furnace. It was experiencing high tube metal temperatures in excess of the maximum allowable by design. This was a recurrent issue observed in 12 assessment reports between June 2014 and January 2017. Notwithstanding the 12 assessment reports by the Petrojam internal engineers, the general manager engaged the service of another engineering firm to carry out an emergency inspection on January 9th, 2017, notwithstanding the fact that a routine inspection was conducted the day before, on January 8th, 2017. And unsurprisingly, both assessments concluded similar results. What would have justified the general manager, in breach of the procurement guidelines, engaging this overseas consultant at a cost of $25.6 thousand US to perform this check on the furnace to tell us the same thing that your own engineers had done 12 times, including up to the day before this person was commissioned? How do you explain that, Mr. Watson?
I cannot explain what was the thinking of the general manager at the time. So I don't know if I can answer that question.
Petrojam indicated on the procurement request that it utilized the direct contracting methodology because of extreme urgency brought about by unforeseen events, and the product service could not be obtained in time through a competitive bidding process. If these same observations had been made 12 times over the previous 2.5 years, almost 3 years, where does this extreme urgency brought about by unforeseen events come from? Can you, maybe the gentleman, one of your experts there, could explain it?
The project engineer would have been Simeon, I think. Yes, Simeon? So but I'm not sure what the thinking was of the general manager. As you rightly said, the study was done over a period of time. So we had the in-house assessment and we understood what was creating some of the issues. So I'm not sure. I
So you would say, without more, this was an unnecessary expenditure?
On the face of what I read, yes.
Okay. I want to go now to the actual bid evaluation for the furnace. Petrojam utilized a limited tendering methodology to invite 3 prospective bidders, including the consultant for the design and supply of a new power former furnace. Just for clarity, from the Auditor General, is this consultant the same one that was engaged to do the assessment? The emergency assessment?
What's the name of that firm?
Yes, I believe it was the same concept.
So that
CH Solutions, right? CHS, Complete Heat Solutions, I think.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Complete Heat Solutions, right? Complete Heat Solutions, Heat, H-E-A-T.
Complete Heat Solutions Limited. This is a CHS, a U.S. company.
Yes.
So they were brought in on an emergency basis to do an assessment, which we paid them $25,680 US to do, and then shortly after, they were then put in a limited tender with this, in a sense, inside information, since you've already paid them to do their assessment. This would normally have been a cost of bidding by all three bidders, but they have an inside track already. You have table 21, which shows you the extract from the bid evaluation, and it shows two bidders being compliant or responsive, to use the terms on the table. Bidder 1, who is the same consultant, CHS, one who bid $1.9 million US, and bidder 3, who bid $863,000 US, less than half of what bidder 1 bid. Both compliant with the terms of the tender, both from the bid evaluation, and yet the contract was given to the consultant who had the inside track at more than twice the cost of the other responsive bidder. Could you explain why that would happen?
I can't explain it, member. As I said, and you pointed it out, typically if you're the consultant on the job, you would not be given the contract for the works unless it's a very specific and special circumstances. The rest of it I cannot answer.
Because the consultant would be in an advantageous position relative to the other bidders.
That's correct. Okay.
So this must have been a favored consultant. And it's, interestingly, Petrojam had estimated the cost at $1,065,000.
At 1 million,
yeah,
right.
just over 1 million US. But the consultant tendered at 1.9 million and won the tender.
So the delivery time proposed was 68 days. Could you say how much time it actually took?
Well, just over a year. Well, it's just over a year. So we have the furnace now, but I think there's one part missing, what they call a soot blow, I think. So there's a burner and a soot blow. It's part of the furnace makeup. It's over a year, and the furnace is not yet installed. So the 68 days did not obtain.
They left a zero off accidentally, did they?
Sorry? In
the period, they accidentally left a zero off.
The chairman is being facetious. Don't be distracted by him. So, Mr. Watson, and I know that you are not the general manager that is referred to in this case study, but to my mind, it is a case study of how not to conduct public procurement. It is a case study in wasting taxpayers' funds. It is a case study in how to abuse the procurement process, because you have brought in a consultant on an emergency basis, pay them almost $26,000 US to do an evaluation, which you have already done 12 times by your own internal engineers, which tells you nothing new, but which prepares that consultant to have an inside track in the tender process. They then tender almost twice what you have estimated it to cost, and more than twice the amount the tender from the other responsive bidder. You give them, you Petrojam, give them the contract, which they were to deliver in 68 days, and we're almost 2 years now down the road, and they still have not delivered it. It is still not functioning. This is scandalous, Mr. Watson. And I cannot understand why, for example, we would be leaving this out of the forensic audit PS when it is over $1 million of taxpayer funds wasted. And it may very well be 2 million, because we don't know if this furnace will ever become functional. From what I'm hearing, if it was supposed to have been in 68 days and after 2 years it still hasn't, it may never ever become functional. And it is, you know, somebody, Mr. Chairman, this is misconduct in a public office.
To the heights.
You know, to speak euphemistically, my own suspicion is that this is fraud. There has to be some kickback in this thing. No, it makes absolutely no sense. Nobody can give me an objective explanation to justify this. It has to be fraud.
You spend $24,000 to give a consultant an inside track in a bid. The tender is nearly twice what the estimate is. They say they're going to complete the project in 68 days. 2 years later, it still hasn't been completed. And there was another bid for 800 and something thousand, less than their estimate, and they weren't successful. It smells rotten. Rotten. Members, it's 12:30.
At least I respect Mr. Watson and the team for not even trying to defend this, because quite frankly it's indefensible. But I don't know if Mr. Warmington wants to try and defend it.
No, I'm not. Don't go there. The issue is, you are not asking Mr. Watson to answer any questions. You put it to Mr. Watson, a question you know he will not be able to answer. I said to you, instead of asking or directing these as questions to Mr. Watson, why don't you just make your statements? Because that's what you're doing. And you agree with
Mr. Watson is the general manager.
I know.
You can't. Mr. Warmington.
You know what I'm saying here.
Mr. Warmington, you can't assume whether or not Mr. Watson may have a view on the matter.
But he can't make all the assumptions making here. It goes both ways, you know. It goes both ways. He's assuming every
He's entitled to
here.
ask the questions arising from the report. It's a very serious matter.
I agree.
And the answers have indicated that Petrojam has nothing really exculpatory to say about it. Yeah. Anyway, members, it's 12:30. It is 12:30, and I'm going to propose that we adjourn. Some of us have some other things that we have to deal with today. I think we've had a good session. I thank everyone for coming and for participating in today's deliberations. In terms of the next meeting, can we meet next week Tuesday? We'll resume next week Tuesday, members. Next week Tuesday, same time, 10 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, members. Member Warmington, will you move the motion for the adjournment? Thank you, sir. Seconded by? Seconded by member.
No. I have no. So why would I want to move it? We're here to examine. We're here to examine the report. But you guys don't want to examine the report. Just want to make it and this combination can accept it.
Because I expected them to be on the switch, so I have to tell you.
Okay, then send it to him. No, let's put it.